Hi everyone. In this video, I will talk about limits on financial flows or capital controls. Capital controls are some type of restriction on financial flows. And remember, the types of financial flows are basically foreign portfolio investment, foreign direct investment, and purchasing foreign currency or putting your currency into foreign banks, foreign bank loans. I'm going to use this Economist article that I've linked here for a couple of examples during this talk. And they give a nice description of capital controls. Capital controls is a loosely defined term. In the post-war period, such capital controls usually took the form of outright prohibition or quotas on the amount of money that could be moved in and out of a country. Some countries, notably China, still employ capital controls, although China has loosened its capital controls lately. The sorts of controls now in favor are lighter touch market-based ones, such as taxes on certain types of flows. For example, a tax on purchasing a bond or a stock. Capital controls were very common up until about the 1980s, and then they started to disappear. And there was a movement towards more open financial markets. In the early 80s, there was a worldwide embrace of more free market, capitalistic types of economic policies, including more openness in financial markets. And this was thought to be especially beneficial for low and middle income countries because they have a hard time generating enough savings in and of themselves to fund domestic investment. So savings from foreigners can help those economies grow. Economists, until recently, were fairly opposed to capital controls. Now, these days, they are sort of back in vogue, and it's an active debate in economics as to how valuable they are. I'm going to again refer to this article to describe some of this. This is kind of a funny description they give. It was as if the Vatican had given its blessing to birth control. The International Monetary Fund, which has long been an ideological guardian of borders open to capital, declared last November that under certain circumstances, capital controls were a good thing. The IMF's conversion reflected some rethinking within the organization, but it also acknowledged what member countries were doing anyway. In 2018, Iceland became the first country in decades to impose capital controls to limit flight of capital from its banks. Between 2009 and 2011, several other countries introduced capital controls to discourage inflows of hot money that they feared would drive their currencies to uncompetitive levels. So if you recall, you had a podcast quiz in chapter 19 for ManQ about capital flight and how that contributed to the Asian financial crisis and caused a depreciation of those currencies. So why the rethinking of capital controls? What are the risks related to free capital movement? Well, capital flight is the risk. There's another term associated with capital flight called sudden stop, which essentially means the same thing as capital flight, a sudden reversal of capital flows. Recall from ManQ chapter 19 the economic effects of capital flights. So in the loanable funds market, that causes higher interest rates. Higher interest rates typically reduce aggregate demand because they make borrowing more expensive in an economy. So it's a force to slow the economy in the short run. And capital flight causes exchange rate depreciation. And the worst case scenario is that you have a massive, drastic decrease in your exchange rate, which is called a currency crisis. Our textbook refers to it as an exchange rate crisis. We'll talk about exchange rate crises in chapter 12, which is the chapter about financial crises, because this is one type of financial crisis. So, why implement capital controls? Sometimes in order to prevent a currency crisis or a large depreciation in the exchange rate. So, for example, Argentina is experiencing a collapse in the value of their currency right now, and they have implemented some capital controls, namely restricting the purchase of dollars as it burns through its reserves in an effort to prop up the peso. That's actually the topic of our next lecture, next class. But here you also have the example of Brazil using currency controls not to prevent their currency from depreciating, but to prevent it from appreciating too much and being too volatile in general. Let's look at some of the details surrounding the Brazilian example in the 2011 through 13 period. So during that time in the United States, quantitative easing was happening. That was a type of expansionary monetary policy that lowered interest rates in the United States. Brazil got out of the recession in 2009 more quickly than the United States did. And so interest rates were higher in Brazil around this time period. Money chases yield. So lots of capital flowed into Brazil. And to try to mitigate volatility on their exchange rate, they imposed a financial transaction tax of 2% on foreign purchases of stocks and bonds. They broadened that tax and raised it to 6% in 2010. The goal, said Brazil's central bank, was to smooth exchange rate fluctuations and make his country's banks less vulnerable to sudden outflow of capital. The Brazilian government put it rather differently. The finance minister spoke of the need to act on the exchange rate and help Brazilian industry survive what he called currency wars, triggered by easy American monetary policy. So because the United States was implementing expansionary monetary policy, the dollar was depreciating because capital was flowing out of the United States and into Brazil, and that was making the Brazilian currency appreciate. Brazilian industry pushed for the controls, complaining about the high exchange rate. Later, those capital flows reversed, and officials argued that the reversal would have been far worse had the controls not tempered the inflows in the first place. So their currency, the real, depreciated at that time because of the capital flow reversal that happened later when the United States started raising interest rates. But they essentially claimed that the volatility in their exchange rate was tempered because of the capital controls. We knew this was going to come and we prepared ourselves. So they learned the lessons of the Asian financial crisis to some degree. And that is a big, major explanation as to why countries now are open to implementing capital controls. It's a way to mitigate exchange rate volatility. And extreme exchange rate volatility can cause major problems. We'll talk more about that in chapter 12. So the main benefit of free capital flow is that it opens up the possibility of more investment in your economy. But the main drawback is the risk of sudden capital flight. Sudden capital flight is essentially a drastic reduction in the amount of credit available in the economy. So it can cause reductions in consumption and government spending to have less credit. And that brings down spending, at least in the short run. Okay, key points. Large outflows of financial capital created economic instability in many countries, especially the 90s, just like the Asian financial crisis. This has created an active debate over the merits of capital controls, and economists are somewhat divided on this point. The textbook says it well, sums it up well, when it says the key is to capture the benefits of increased investment while minimizing the risks of capital flight.